Josephine Blackburn stared at her brothers with eyes wide in disbelief, the words they had spoken hanging in the air like a death sentence. "You did what?" she whispered, her voice cracking as the reality of her situation crashed down upon her like a rockslide. It was 1876 in Belmont, Nevada, a silver mining town nestled in the rugged mountain terrain that had seen better days. The once booming settlement had begun its slow decline as the veins of precious metal thinned, leaving many, including the Blackburn family, struggling to survive in its wake. "We ain't had a choice, Josie," muttered Samuel, the elder of her two brothers, unable to meet her gaze. At 32, he had the weathered look of a man a decade older, years of mining and hard drinking having carved deep lines into his face. The debt was due, and Harrison wasn't accepting excuses no more. Beside him, 28-year-old Tobias nodded grimly, twisting his hat in his hands. $2,000, Josie. 2,000 we ain't got and never will have." His voice was softer than Samuel's, but carried the same note of finality. Harrison was going to take the homestead, everything Pa worked for. Josephine's hands trembled as she clutched the edge of the kitchen table in their small, dilapidated cabin. At 24, she had been the one holding what remained of their family together since their parents' deaths 3 years prior, cooking, cleaning, mending, and even taking in laundry from the miners to supplement her brother's dwindling income. "So you sold me." The words felt foreign on her tongue, impossible to comprehend despite having heard them clearly. Like cattle, to settle a gambling debt, Samuel's face flushed with a mixture of shame and anger. "It ain't like that. Wilson's a decent enough man, owns that big spread north of town." "He's looking for a wife, and Wilson Garrick," Josephine recoiled. "The man is 60 if he's a day, and he's buried 2 wives already." Tobias shifted uncomfortably. "He offered 1,000 for your hand. It ain't enough, but it's something." "And Harrison agreed to take it as partial payment," Samuel added quickly. "Give us time to work off the rest." Josephine felt the room spin around her. Wilson Garrick was a cruel man with hands like sandpaper who looked at women as property. The thought of being bound to him made her stomach turn. "When?" was all she could manage to ask. "Tomorrow morning," Samuel replied. "He's coming with the preacher at 10. Josephine backed away from them, feeling trapped. In her mind, she calculated her options, which were painfully few. She had $5 saved, hidden in her mother's old Bible. Not enough to get far, and where would she go? A single woman with no family, no connections. The alternatives to marriage were often worse. "I need air," she whispered, turning toward the door. Neither brother tried to stop her as she stepped out into the crisp autumn evening. The sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and gold that Josephine barely noticed through her tears. She walked without purpose, her mind racing, until she found herself on the outskirts of town near the livery stable. The sound of horses and men's voices drifted through the twilight. A group of riders had just arrived, trail dust still clinging to their clothes. Cowboys, by the look of them, probably delivering cattle to one of the larger ranches in the area. They paid her no mind as she slipped past, heading for the small church at the edge of town. It was there, sitting alone on the steps in the growing darkness, that Josephine allowed herself to truly weep. Her future had been decided without her consent, sold away by the very people who should have protected her. By morning, she would be Mrs. Wilson Garrick, bound to a man 3 times her age until death likely his, given his habits, but that could be years of misery away. As she sat with her face in her hands, she didn't notice the approaching footsteps until a deep voice spoke above her. "Excuse me, madam, are you all right?" Josephine looked up, startled, quickly wiping away her tears. The man standing before her was tall, his features difficult to make out in the dim light. But she could tell he was young, perhaps 30, and carried himself with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to the saddle. "I'm fine," she managed, rising to her feet, embarrassed to be caught in such a state. Just taking some evening air." The stranger nodded, though his posture suggested he didn't believe her. "Xavier Lancaster," he introduced himself, tipping his hat. "Passing through with a herd bound for California." "Josephine Blackburn," she replied automatically, then immediately regretted giving her name to a stranger. She knew better than to talk to unknown men alone at night, but something in his manner didn't strike her as threatening. "Well, Miss Blackburn, it's not safe for a lady to be out alone after dark, even in a town this size." His voice carried a slight accent she couldn't place, something Eastern, perhaps. "May I walk you home?" Josephine almost laughed at the offer. Home was the last place she wanted to go. "That's kind, Mr. Lancaster, but unnecessary. I know my way," he nodded respectfully. "As you wish." But instead of leaving, he sat down on the church steps, a respectful distance from where she had been. "Don't mind me, just resting my legs before heading back to camp." "Been in the saddle since dawn." Josephine hesitated, then slowly sat back down. There was something calming about this stranger's presence, and she wasn't ready to face her brothers again just yet. "Are you sure there's nothing troubling you?" Xavier asked after a moment of silence. "I don't mean to pry, but in my experience, people don't usually sit alone on church steps crying unless something's weighing heavy on their hearts." Perhaps it was his gentle tone, or the fact that he was a stranger passing through who she'd likely never see again, but Josephine found herself speaking before she could think better of it. "My brothers sold me," she said flatly, "to cover a gambling debt." Xavier went very still beside her. "I beg your pardon." The words came tumbling out, then the debt to Harrison, the arrangement with Wilson Garrick, the wedding planned for tomorrow that would sentence her to a life of servitude to a man she feared and despised. $2,000, she finished bitterly. "Apparently that's my worth, though Garrick only offered half. The rest my brothers will work off in Harrison's mine." For a long moment, Xavier said nothing, and Josephine feared she had shocked him with her impropriety. Ladies didn't discuss such matters with strangers, especially men. But when she dared glance at him, his expression wasn't one of judgment but of controlled anger. "And you have no say in this arrangement?" he asked finally, his voice carefully even. Josephine gave a humorless laugh. "What say would I have? I have no money, no family besides my brothers, nowhere to go. Women don't have many choices in this world, Mr. Lancaster." "Xavier," he corrected automatically. "And there are always choices, Miss Blackburn. Sometimes we just need help seeing them." Before she could respond, the church door opened behind them and Pastor Miller stepped out, looking surprised to find them there. "Miss Blackburn, and I don't believe we've met, sir." "Xavier Lancaster," he introduced himself again, standing and offering his hand. "Just passing through with a cattle drive." The pastor shook his hand, then turned to Josephine with concern. "Is everything all right, my dear?" Samuel was by earlier discussing arrangements for tomorrow. Josephine felt her face burn with shame. So the whole town would know of her situation by morning. "Yes, Pastor," she managed to say. "I was just seeking guidance." Pastor Miller nodded sympathetically. "Marriage is indeed a significant step. Wilson Garrick is, well, he's established. He can provide stability." "If you'll excuse me," Josephine said quickly, unable to bear the pitying look in the pastor's eyes. "I should get home before my brothers worry." Xavier stepped aside to let her pass but spoke before she could leave. "It was a pleasure meeting you, Miss Blackburn. I wish you all the happiness in the world, whatever path you choose." There was something in his tone, a subtle emphasis on the word choose, that made her pause and look back at him. For the first time, she really saw him in the light spilling from the church's open door. He was handsome in a rugged way, with keen blue eyes and dark hair visible beneath his hat. But it was the intensity in his gaze that caught her, like he was trying to communicate something more than his words conveyed. "Thank you, Mr. Lancaster," she replied carefully. "Safe travels to California." As she walked away, she could feel his eyes on her back, and for reasons she couldn't explain, the weight of her situation felt marginally lighter. Dawn broke with a merciless clarity over Belmont. Josephine had barely slept, her mind racing between desperate plans of escape and resigned acceptance of her fate. She rose early, washing her face in the basin of cold water and staring at her reflection in the small, cracked mirror above it. Her brown eyes were rimmed with red from crying, her normally vibrant face pale with dread. She brushed her long chestnut hair methodically, then pinned it up in a simple but neat style. If she was to be sold like livestock, she would at least face it with dignity. Samuel and Tobias were already awake, the tension in the small cabin thick enough to cut with a knife. They moved around her cautiously like she might shatter or explode. "I made coffee," Tobias offered, his voice unusually gentle, "and there's some bread left." Josephine nodded but couldn't bring herself to eat. Her stomach was in knots, her throat tight with unshed tears. She simply sat at the table, staring at nothing as the clock ticked inexorably toward 10. At 9:30, a knock at the door made them all jump. Samuel answered it, his brow furrowing in confusion at whatever he saw. "Can I help you?" he asked. "Name's Lancaster." The voice sent a jolt through Josephine. "I understand you're Blackburn." "That's right," Samuel replied cautiously. "What's your business here?" "I'd like to discuss a proposition with you, a business matter." Samuel glanced back at Josephine, then stepped outside, closing the door behind him. Tobias moved to the window, peering out curiously. "Cowboy," he murmured. "Well dressed for a drover." Minutes ticked by. Josephine sat frozen, afraid to hope yet unable to stop the wild beating of her heart. When the door finally opened again, Samuel's expression was unreadable. "Josie," he said slowly, "this man, he wants to talk to you." Xavier Lancaster stepped into the cabin, removing his hat as he did so. In the daylight, he looked even more impressive, tall and broad-shouldered, his clothes dusty but of good quality, his face tanned from the sun but his blue eyes startlingly bright against his skin. "Miss Blackburn," he greeted her with a nod. "I apologize for the intrusion." Josephine stood, her legs unsteady beneath her. "Mr. Lancaster," she returned, aware of her brother's confused looks. "What brings you here?" "I've been discussing a matter with your brother." His gaze flicked to Samuel, then back to her. "It concerns you directly, so I thought it right you should be part of the conversation." Samuel cleared his throat. "Mr. Lancaster has offered to, that is, he's proposed an alternative arrangement for your situation." Josephine's heart skipped a beat. "What kind of arrangement?" Xavier stepped forward, his expression serious. "Miss Blackburn, I'll be direct. I've offered your brothers $4,000 for your hand in marriage instead." The room went silent. Josephine stared at him, certain she had misheard. 4,000. "Double what Harrison is owed," Xavier confirmed. "Enough to clear the debt entirely and leave something for your brothers to start fresh." Tobias let out a low whistle. "It's a fortune, Josie." Josephine's mind reeled. She barely knew this man had spoken to him only once for less than an hour. Was he mad, or was there something sinister behind his offer? "Why?" she asked bluntly. "Why would you do this?" Xavier's expression softened slightly. "Because no person should be treated as property, because I heard the fear in your voice last night, and because—" He hesitated, then continued more quietly, "Because when I saw you sitting on those church steps, something told me our paths crossing wasn't just chance." It sounded absurd, romantic nonsense from novels. Yet there was a sincerity in his eyes that made her pause. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Lancaster?" she asked carefully. "Marriage, as I said, legal and binding, but with conditions." He glanced at her brothers, then back to her. "I would ask that we leave today, immediately after the ceremony. I have business that can't wait. We would travel west to California, where I have property." "And what would be expected of me?" Josephine held her breath, waiting for the catch. "Companionship," he answered simply. "A partnership." "I won't pretend this is a love match, Miss Blackburn, but I can offer you respect, security, and my solemn vow that you will never be mistreated." Before Josephine could respond, another knock came at the door. Tobias opened it to reveal Wilson Garrick standing on the porch, the pastor just behind him. Garrick was a squat, balding man with small eyes and a perpetual scowl, dressed in his Sunday best despite the early hour. "We're early," he announced without preamble, his gaze finding Josephine and raking over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "But I'm eager to get this done. Got work waiting back at the ranch." Xavier turned to face the newcomer, his posture straightening almost imperceptibly. "Mr. Garrick, I presume." Garrick's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "Who's asking?" "Xavier Lancaster." He offered no hand to shake. "I'm afraid there's been a change of plans regarding Miss Blackburn." The older man's face darkened. What's this about, Blackburn? He demanded, looking past Xavier to Samuel. Samuel shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Lancaster has made a more substantial offer. Offer, Garrick spat. We had a deal, the arrangements are made. Nothing was signed, Tobias interjected. And Mr. Lancaster is offering enough to clear the entire debt with Harrison. Pastor Miller looked bewildered, his gaze darting between the men. I don't understand what's happening here. Garrick's face had turned an alarming shade of red. This is outrageous. You can't just auction her off to the highest bidder. Isn't that exactly what you were doing? Xavier's voice was dangerously soft. Buying a wife at a discount because her brothers were desperate, the older man spluttered, hands clenching into fists. Now see here, enough. Josephine's voice cut through the tension. She stepped forward, standing beside Xavier. I believe I should have some say in my own future. She turned to Xavier, searching his face for any sign of deception. If I agree to this, you swear I will be treated with respect. That I will have some freedom in this partnership. You have my word, Xavier replied solemnly, and I would be willing to put such terms in writing before the ceremony. Josephine took a deep breath, then turned to Pastor Miller. Would you be willing to perform a marriage ceremony today, Pastor, between myself and Mr. Lancaster? The pastor blinked in surprise. Aye. Well, yes, if that is your wish, Miss Blackburn, though this is all rather irregular. Josephine, you can't be serious, Garrick spluttered. You don't even know this man. I know enough, she replied firmly, surprised at the steadiness of her own voice. I know that he offers me a choice which is more than you or my brothers did. Garrick turned to Samuel, his expression furious. This is a breach of our agreement. I'll see you ruined for this. Samuel stepped forward, his own temper flaring. There's no breach. You offered 1,000 for my sister. Mr. Lancaster is offering 4 times that. Any man would take the better deal. And what of Harrison? You think he'll just accept this change of plans? Garrick threatened. I'll speak with Harrison myself, Xavier interjected smoothly. $4,000 should satisfy even the most demanding creditor. Garrick looked like he might argue further, but something in Xavier's stance made him reconsider. With a final glare at Josephine, he jammed his hat back on his head and stormed out, shouldering roughly past the pastor. In the silence that followed, Pastor Miller cleared his throat. Well, if you're certain about this, Miss Blackburn, perhaps we should discuss the details. A marriage is still a sacred covenant, even in unusual circumstances. Josephine looked at Xavier, still half convinced she was dreaming. I would like some time to speak with Mr. Lancaster alone before I make my final decision. The pastor nodded. Of course. I'll be at the church when you're ready. He gave them all a bemused look, then took his leave. Samuel and Tobias exchanged glances. We'll give you some privacy, Samuel said awkwardly, gesturing for Tobias to follow him outside. When the door closed behind them, Josephine turned to Xavier, her heart pounding. Why are you really doing this, Mr. Lancaster? The truth, please. Xavier regarded her for a long moment. The truth is complicated, Miss Blackburn. Part of it is, as I said, I believe what your brothers were doing is wrong, and I have the means to prevent it. But there's more. I'm listening. He took a deep breath. I do need a wife. My situation in California is delicate. I have a substantial ranch near Sacramento inherited from my uncle. The terms of his will state that I must be married by my 30th birthday to retain full ownership. Josephine's eyes widened. And when is your 30th birthday? 3 months from now. He had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. I've put off the matter, hoping to find a suitable match naturally, but time is running short. So I would be a convenient solution to your problem, Josephine concluded, unsure whether to be relieved or offended by his honesty. A mutually beneficial arrangement, Xavier corrected. You escape a marriage to a man you clearly fear, and I fulfill the conditions of my inheritance. But I meant what I said about respect and partnership, Miss Blackburn. This wouldn't be a marriage in name, only I would expect us to build a life together, to at least attempt to form a real bond. Josephine studied him, trying to determine if he was sincere. And if we find we cannot form such a bond, if we are incompatible, then we would negotiate terms that allow us both to live with dignity, he replied simply. I won't hold you prisoner, Miss Blackburn. But I hope it won't come to that. She turned away, moving to the window to gather her thoughts. Outside, she could see her brothers talking in low voices, occasionally glancing back at the cabin. Beyond them lay Belmont, the only home she had ever known, yet one that now felt like a prison. Beyond that were the mountains, and beyond those mountains, California. A new life, unknown and frightening, but perhaps better than the one awaiting her here. $4,000 is an extraordinary sum, she said finally. Most of the men in this town wouldn't pay that for the finest horse in Nevada. Xavier moved to stand beside her, keeping a respectful distance. It's a fair price to save 2 lives, yours from misery and mine from losing everything I've worked for. Josephine turned to face him. If I agree to this, we leave today, immediately after the ceremony, he nodded. I have men waiting with the herd about 5 miles outside of town. We join them and continue west. I have almost nothing to bring with me, she warned. Just a few dresses, my mother's Bible, some personal items. We can acquire whatever else you need along the way, he assured her. Josephine took a deep breath, knowing she was about to leap into the unknown with a stranger. But when she compared that leap to the certainty of life with Wilson Garrick, there was really no choice at all. Very well, Mr. Lancaster, I accept your proposal. Relief washed over his features. Thank you, Miss Blackburn. I promise you won't regret this decision. She gave him a small, wry smile. I suppose we should start using our given names if we're to be married by noon. Josephine, he said, as if testing how it felt on his tongue. And please call me Xavier. She nodded, then straightened her shoulders, preparing herself for what was to come. We should tell my brothers and the pastor then, and I'll need to pack my things. As she moved toward the door, Xavier gently caught her arm. One more thing, he said, reaching into his vest pocket. He withdrew a simple gold band. It was my mother's. I'd be honored if you would wear it. Josephine stared at the ring, the reality of what she was agreeing to suddenly hitting her full force. It's lovely, she managed to say. Are you certain you want to give me something so personal? We barely know each other. Marriage is a leap of faith even for those who think they know each other well, he replied, his voice gentle. Perhaps starting with a token of trust isn't such a bad foundation. With trembling fingers, Josephine accepted the ring, closing her hand around it. I'll wear it with respect, she promised. They stood there for a moment, 2 strangers about to bind their lives together, both aware of the enormity of what they were undertaking. Shall we? Xavier finally asked, gesturing toward the door. Josephine nodded, squaring her shoulders. Yes. Let's get married. The wedding was a brief, simple affair at the small church. Pastor Miller performed the ceremony with a mixture of confusion and concern, but didn't object when Josephine assured him she was entering into the marriage of her own free will. Her brothers stood as witnesses, Samuel watching the proceedings with calculating eyes, while Tobias seemed genuinely relieved that his sister had found a better option than Wilson Garrick. Xavier was solemn throughout, speaking his vows clearly and firmly. When he slipped the gold band onto Josephine's finger, his hands were steady, his gaze direct. Josephine, for her part, felt as though she were in a dream or perhaps a play where she had been thrust onstage without knowing her lines. Yet she spoke her vows with as much conviction as she could muster, promising to honor and cherish a man she had known for less than a day. By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife, Pastor Miller concluded, still looking somewhat bewildered by the hasty proceedings. You may kiss the bride. Xavier hesitated, perhaps sensing Josephine's nervousness. Instead of the customary kiss, he simply raised her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Mrs. Lancaster, he said softly, and though Josephine knew it was part of the performance, something in the way he said it sent an unexpected flutter through her chest. Immediately after the ceremony, Xavier excused himself to visit the bank and settle matters with Harrison. While he was gone, Josephine returned to the cabin with her brothers to gather her meager belongings. You realize this is madness, don't you? Samuel said as he watched her fold her mother's quilt into a small traveling bag. Riding off with a stranger like this. As opposed to being handed over to Wilson Garrick, Josephine countered, not pausing in her packing. At least this stranger offered me a choice and treated me with respect. But California, Josie, Tobias interjected. It's so far, what if things don't work out? What if he's not what he seems? Josephine finally stopped, turning to face her brothers. Then I'll face that challenge when it comes, but I'm not a child anymore and I've been caring for this household since Ma and Pa died. I can take care of myself. Samuel had the grace to look ashamed. We were trying to protect you, the debt. Harrison was threatening to take everything. By selling me to a man old enough to be my father, a man known for working his wives to death, Josephine shook her head. That wasn't protection, Samuel. That was using me as currency. And how is this any different? He challenged. You're still being bartered for money. The difference, Josephine replied evenly, is that Xavier Lancaster asked me. He gave me a choice, and he's paying enough to clear your debt entirely, which means you and Tobias will be free men again. She closed her bag with finality. Consider it my parting gift to you both. A knock at the door interrupted them. Tobias answered it to find Xavier standing there, a leather pouch in his hand. It's done, he announced, stepping inside. Harrison has been paid in full with a written receipt. He handed the pouch to Samuel. The remaining 1,000 as agreed, for a fresh start. Samuel took the pouch with visible disbelief, weighing it in his hand as if suspecting some trick. I still don't understand why you're doing this. Xavier glanced at Josephine, then back to her brother. Sometimes a man knows value when he sees it, even if others don't recognize it. He turned to Josephine. Are you ready? The men will be wondering where I am, and we have a long journey ahead. She nodded, suddenly feeling the weight of what she was doing. She was leaving everything she had ever known, everyone familiar, to journey to a strange land with a man who was still, despite everything, a stranger to her. Gathering her courage, she embraced Tobias, who hugged her fiercely in return. Take care of yourself, little sister, he whispered. Right when you can. When she turned to Samuel, he stood stiff and uncomfortable, clearly struggling with his emotions. I'm sorry, Josie, he finally said, his voice rough, for everything. She embraced him as well, feeling some of the anger that had been building in her heart begin to dissolve. Be better, Samuel. Use this chance wisely. With a final look around the cabin that had been her home her entire life, Josephine picked up her bag and moved to Xavier's side. I'm ready. Outside, a handsome chestnut mare stood waiting alongside Xavier's own mount, a powerful black stallion. I arranged for the horse while at the bank, Xavier explained, helping Josephine secure her bag. I thought you might prefer your own mount for the journey, rather than riding double. Josephine appreciated the thoughtfulness, though she wondered how many more surprises this day would bring. Thank you, she said simply, accepting his help to mount the mare. As they rode out of Belmont, Josephine felt the curious stares of townsfolk who had heard rumors of the morning's events. She sat straight in her saddle, determined not to show any doubt or regret, even as her heart pounded with uncertainty about what lay ahead. They rode in silence until the town disappeared behind them, the only sounds the steady rhythm of hoofbeats and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. Josephine studied her new husband's profile as he rode beside her, the straight line of his jaw, the quiet concentration in his eyes as he scanned the horizon. What kind of man was he, really? What had she committed herself to? You're very quiet, Xavier observed after a while, glancing over at her. Having regrets already, Josephine shook her head. Not regrets, just questions, concerns. This is all happening so quickly. He nodded understandingly. Ask whatever you wish. We have plenty of time to talk on the journey west. She considered where to begin. Tell me about this ranch in California. What is it like? A genuine smile crossed his face for the first time that day. It's beautiful. The Sacramento Valley is fertile land, rolling hills, oak trees, streams that run year-round. The main house needs work, but it's solid. My uncle built it 20 years ago when he first struck gold and decided to invest in land rather than gambling his fortune away like so many others. And you inherited it recently? 2 years ago, Xavier confirmed. I've spent most of that time getting the operation running properly again. My uncle was more of a dreamer than a practical rancher. What did you do before that? Josephine asked, realizing how little she knew about the man she had just married. I was an army officer, he replied. stationed mainly in Arizona Territory. Left the service after 10 years when my uncle passed. That explained his bearing. Josephine thought the natural authority in his posture, the way he assessed their surroundings with practiced ease. And your family? A shadow crossed his face. Gone. My parents died of fever when I was 16. No siblings. My uncle was my only living relative, which is why he left everything to me. I'm sorry, Josephine said softly, understanding loss all too well. My parents died 3 years ago. Consumption took my mother and my father. He just gave up afterward. His heart, the doctor said, but I think it was grief. Xavier's expression softened. Then we have that in common at least. After a moment, he added, what about you? What were you doing before your brothers decided to arrange your future? Josephine gave a small, humorless laugh. Surviving. Keeping house for my brothers. Taking in laundry and mending from the miners when we needed extra money, which was most of the time. Not a very exciting life, I'm afraid. And what would you have chosen if you could have? He asked, surprising her with his interest. If circumstances had been different, the question caught her off guard. No one had ever asked her what she wanted before. I would have liked to be a teacher, I think. I always enjoyed learning, and I taught the younger children in town sometimes when their parents couldn't afford the school fees. Xavier nodded thoughtfully. There's a growing need for teachers in California. The settlements are expanding rapidly, families moving west. Perhaps that's something you could pursue once we're established. Josephine looked at him in surprise. You would allow that, his brow furrowed. Allow? It's not a matter of allowing, Josephine. You're my wife now, not my property. I meant what I said about a partnership. She flushed, embarrassed. I'm sorry, it's just, that's not how marriages typically work in my experience. Perhaps we can build something better, he suggested, his voice gentle but firm, something based on mutual respect rather than ownership. Before Josephine could respond, they crested a hill, and she saw the cattle herd spread out in the valley below, with several riders moving among the animals. A camp had been set up nearby with wagons and a cook fire already going. My men, Xavier explained. 7 drovers, a cook, and a wrangler for the spare horses. Good men, all of them. They've worked for me for over a year now. As they rode down toward the camp, the men noticed their approach. One rider broke away from the herd and came to meet them, an older man with a weathered face and a shock of white hair beneath his hat. Mr. Lancaster? He called as he neared, beginning to wonder if you'd run into trouble. Just taking care of important business, Frank, Xavier replied, his tone warm. He glanced at Josephine. I'd like you to meet my wife, Josephine Lancaster. We were married this morning in Belmont. Frank's eyebrows shot up in surprise, but he recovered quickly, touching the brim of his hat. Madam, Frank Murphy, foreman, it's an honor to meet you. Thank you, Mr. Murphy, Josephine replied, feeling strange at being introduced with her new surname. Frank, please have the men gather at camp. I'd like to introduce Mrs. Lancaster to everyone before we move out. Xavier turned to Josephine. Unless you're too tired, it's been quite a day already. No, I'm fine, she assured him, though in truth she felt overwhelmed by all the changes. But she knew the importance of making a good impression on these men who would be her traveling companions for the next several weeks. As Frank rode off to gather the others, Xavier led Josephine to the camp. She could feel the curious glances of the drovers as they approached and heard the low murmur of surprised conversation. Clearly, their boss returning with a bride was unexpected news. The men assembled quickly, a diverse group ranging from grizzled veterans like Frank to younger cowboys barely out of their teens. They removed their hats as Xavier introduced Josephine, their expressions varying from surprise to curiosity to, in a few cases, open admiration. Mrs. Lancaster and I were married this morning, Xavier explained simply. She'll be traveling with us to California. I expect her to be treated with the same respect you show me. Yes, sir, came the chorus of replies, though Josephine could see the questions in their eyes. We'll be moving out within the hour, Xavier continued. Frank makes sure everything's secured for travel. As the men dispersed to their duties, Xavier led Josephine to one of the wagons. You can rest here if you'd like. The cook, Hector, has coffee going, and there should be some food ready soon. Josephine nodded, suddenly feeling the enormity of the day's events. In less than 12 hours, she had gone from facing a dreaded marriage to a man she feared, to becoming the wife of a stranger who was taking her hundreds of miles from everything familiar. The emotional whiplash left her dizzy. "I think I will rest for a bit," she admitted. "It's been quite a morning." Xavier helped her down from her horse with careful hands. "Of course, take whatever time you need, we won't leave without you." As she settled on a crate near the cook fire, accepting a cup of coffee from the friendly, round-faced Hector, Josephine watched Xavier move among his men, giving instructions and checking preparations with practiced efficiency. He carried himself with natural authority, but there was no cruelty or harshness in his manner, just clear expectations and mutual respect. What kind of husband would he be? She wondered, turning the gold band on her finger. Only time would tell whether she had escaped one form of servitude only to enter another, or whether Xavier Lancaster's talk of partnership and respect would prove to be more than just words. For now, all she could do was move forward, one day at a time, into the uncertain future she had chosen. The cattle drive moved steadily westward over the following days, settling into a rhythm that Josephine gradually adapted to. They rose before dawn each morning, ate a simple breakfast prepared by Hector, then broke camp and got the herd moving by first light. They traveled until midday, when they would stop briefly to rest the cattle and have a cold meal, then continued until dusk when camp would be established for the night. Xavier had arranged for a small tent to be set up each evening for Josephine's privacy, a consideration she deeply appreciated. He himself slept outside with the men, taking his turn at night watch like any other member of the crew. This earned him visible respect from the drovers, who clearly valued a boss who didn't consider himself above the work. On their fourth night on the trail, as they camped in a sheltered valley near the California border, Josephine sat by the fire after dinner, mending a tear in one of her dresses. The men had mostly retired to their bedrolls, except for those on watch and Xavier, who was studying a map by the firelight. "May I join you?" he asked, glancing up from his work. Josephine nodded, setting aside her sewing. "Of course." He moved to sit beside her, rolling up the map and tucking it into his saddlebag. "How are you holding up? I know this kind of travel isn't easy, especially when it's unfamiliar." "I'm managing better than I expected," she admitted. "Though I suspect I'll be grateful for a real bed when we reach your ranch." "Our ranch," he corrected gently. "And yes, I think we'll all appreciate solid walls and proper beds after 3 weeks on the trail." They sat in companionable silence for a few moments, watching the flames dance in the fire pit. Despite the strangeness of her situation, Josephine had to admit that Xavier had been nothing but respectful since their hasty marriage. He had kept a careful distance, never presuming, always treating her with the courtesy due a lady, not a purchased bride. "May I ask you something personal?" she ventured after a while. Xavier raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Of course. Why didn't you marry before now?" "You mentioned your 30th birthday approaching, the conditions of your inheritance. Surely you had opportunities." He considered the question, his expression thoughtful. "I did. There was a young lady in Sacramento, Catherine Milford. Her father owns the bank there. We courted for a time last year." "What happened?" Josephine asked, curious about this unknown woman who might have been sitting in her place. She wanted city life, society, parties. The ranch was too isolated, too rustic for her tastes. He shrugged. "It was an amicable parting. She married a lawyer from San Francisco last spring." "I see." Josephine hesitated, then asked the question that had been on her mind. "And did you care for her?" Xavier's gaze returned to the fire. "I respected her, admired her intelligence and spirit, but love," he shook his head slightly. "No, I don't think so. Perhaps that was part of the problem." "Do you believe in love?" The question slipped out before she could reconsider it. His eyes met hers across the flames. "I believe it exists. I've seen it, my parents had it, rare as that seems to be. But I'm not sure it's something that can be forced or manufactured on a timeline." "And yet here we are," Josephine said softly, married to meet a deadline. Here we are, he agreed, but I meant what I said in Belmont, Josephine. I don't expect love overnight or perhaps ever. But I do hope for friendship, for mutual respect and regard. The rest, well, that would be a blessing if it comes, but not a requirement. His honesty was oddly comforting. There was no pretense between them, no false declarations or expectations that couldn't be met. Just two people trying to make the best of an unusual situation. What about you? Xavier asked after a moment. Was there someone in Belmont, someone you left behind? Josephine shook her head. No one special. There was a miner, Jacob Stern, who showed interest last year, but… She trailed off, remembering the man's increasing frustration with her refusals to consider his advances. But, Xavier prompted gently, he wanted a housekeeper more than a wife, she finished. Someone to cook his meals and warm his bed. There didn't seem to be much room for me in his plans, the actual person I am, with thoughts and dreams of my own. Xavier nodded, understanding. That seems to be a common shortcoming among men, seeing women as accessories to their lives rather than as full partners. And you don't. Josephine challenged softly. I try not to, he replied. Though I'm sure I have my blind spots, like any man, if I ever treat you that way, I hope you'll tell me. The conversation was interrupted by Frank approaching from the darkness. Boss, we've got a potential problem. Tom spotted riders about a mile back, moving slow like they might be tracking us. Xavier was on his feet immediately, all traces of relaxation gone from his posture. How many? 4, maybe 5, hard to tell in the dark. Rustlers, you think? Frank shrugged. Could be. Or might just be travelers following the same route, but Tom thought it was worth mentioning. Xavier nodded grimly. Double the watch tonight, 4 men instead of 2 in pairs, and have everyone sleep with their weapons close. As Frank moved off to implement the orders, Xavier turned to Josephine, his expression apologetic. I'm sorry, I should check the perimeter myself. Of course, she replied, trying to hide her sudden anxiety. Is there, should I be worried? He hesitated, clearly weighing honesty against reassurance. It's probably nothing. But cattle drives can be targets for thieves, especially as we near more populated areas. Stay close to camp, and if there's any trouble, which I don't expect, go to Hector at the chuck wagon. He stays armed and is a surprisingly good shot for a cook. With that less than comforting instruction, Xavier strode off into the darkness, leaving Josephine alone by the fire with her suddenly racing thoughts. The night passed without incident, though Josephine slept poorly, starting awake at every unusual sound. By morning, the mysterious riders had neither appeared nor been spotted again, and the drive continued on schedule. As they crossed into California later that day, the landscape began to change subtly, the terrain becoming less harsh, with more greenery visible even in the late summer heat. Josephine rode alongside Xavier near the front of the herd, finding herself increasingly comfortable in his company. Tell me more about the ranch, she requested as they navigated a gentle slope. What should I expect when we arrive? Xavier's expression brightened, as it always did when discussing his home. The main house is 2 stories with 6 bedrooms, though as I mentioned, it needs some work. My uncle was more concerned with the cattle operation than the house after my aunt passed. 6 bedrooms, Josephine repeated, surprised. That's practically a mansion compared to what I'm used to. He smiled slightly. It was built with a large family in mind, I think. My aunt and uncle never had children, but they had hoped to. After a moment, he added more hesitantly, I should mention, there are 3 permanent staff at the house. Mrs. Chen is the housekeeper. She came from China 20 years ago and worked for my uncle the entire time. Miguel and his wife Rosa manage the gardens and general maintenance. Josephine nodded, though inwardly she felt a flicker of anxiety. She had never managed household staff before, had never been anything but the staff herself in her role caring for her brothers. Will they? That is, what will they expect of me? As the new mistress of the house, Xavier seemed to understand her concern. They'll expect you to be yourself, Josephine. Mrs. Chen runs the household with impressive efficiency. You can rely on her guidance until you find your feet. They're good people, loyal to the family. And what about neighbors? Is the ranch isolated or are there other properties nearby? The nearest neighbors are the Hendersons, about 3 miles east. Good people James Henderson is a former Army colonel who started ranching about the same time as my uncle. They have 2 daughters, both married now and living in Sacramento. Xavier paused. There's a small town about 10 miles south Sierra Creek. It has the basic necessities: general store, blacksmith, church, schoolhouse. Josephine latched onto the last word. A schoolhouse? Is there a teacher? There was, Xavier replied, Miss Abernathy, but she married a man from San Francisco last spring and moved away. I believe they're still looking for a replacement. He glanced at her with understanding in his eyes. Perhaps something to consider once you're settled. The thought sent a small thrill through Josephine, the possibility that her dream of teaching might actually become reality. Perhaps, she agreed, not wanting to appear too eager about plans that might still prove impractical. They crested a hill, and Xavier pointed to the horizon. See those mountains to the west? Our property starts about 20 miles this side of them and extends almost to their foothills. The house is built on a rise overlooking the valley. Josephine tried to imagine it, this vast spread of land that was now, at least partially, hers. It seemed impossible that just a week ago she had been facing marriage to Wilson Garrick and a life confined to Belmont. As if reading her thoughts, Xavier said quietly, It's a lot to take in, I know. A week ago we were strangers. Now we're husband and wife, heading toward a shared future neither of us planned. Life rarely goes according to plan, Josephine replied, surprising herself with her philosophical tone. My father used to say that the measure of a person isn't how well they follow their plans, but how they adapt when those plans fall apart. Xavier smiled. Your father sounds like a wise man. He was, she agreed, feeling a familiar pang of grief. I think he would have liked you. The words slipped out unplanned, but Josephine realized they were true. Her father had valued honesty, hard work, and treating others with respect, all qualities she had observed in Xavier during their short acquaintance. Xavier looked genuinely touched by her comment. That means more than you know. Their moment of connection was interrupted by Frank riding up to report that one of the younger steers had gone lame. Xavier excused himself to deal with the situation, leaving Josephine to ponder the strange turns her life had taken, and the even stranger fact that she was beginning to feel, if not contentment, then at least a cautious optimism about her future. The remaining journey to the Lancaster ranch passed without major incident. The mysterious riders were never spotted again, though Xavier maintained the doubled night watch as a precaution. With each passing day, Josephine found herself growing more comfortable with the routine of the trail and with the men who made up their traveling party. They were a rough but respectful bunch who clearly held Xavier in high esteem and, by extension, treated his new wife with careful courtesy. 17 days after leaving Belmont, they crested a final hill and Xavier reined in his horse, gesturing for Josephine to do the same. There it is, he said, a note of pride in his voice. Lancaster Ranch, Josephine gasped softly as she took in the view. The valley below was lush and green despite the late summer season, with a river winding through its center. Cattle dotted the grasslands, far more than the herd they had driven from Nevada. And there, on a gentle rise overlooking it all, stood a large 2-story house surrounded by several outbuildings and what appeared to be a well-established orchard. It's beautiful, she breathed, the reality of her new home finally sinking in. This wasn't just a story Xavier had told her during their journey, it was real, substantial, and now in some way hers. Welcome home, Mrs. Lancaster, Xavier said quietly, a smile touching his lips at her evident wonder. They rode down into the valley, the cattle herd following at a steady pace managed by the drovers. As they approached the house, Josephine could see 3 figures emerge onto the wide front porch, presumably the staff Xavier had mentioned. Mrs. Chen proved to be a tiny, straight-backed woman with iron gray hair and sharp, observant eyes that missed nothing. Despite her diminutive size, she carried herself with unmistakable authority. Miguel and Rosa were a middle-aged couple, warm and welcoming, their English accented but clear. Mr. Lancaster, welcome home, Mrs. Chen greeted them as Xavier helped Josephine dismount. Her gaze flickered curiously to Josephine, but her expression remained professionally neutral. "Thank you, Mrs. Chen. I'd like you all to meet my wife, Josephine Lancaster. We were married in Nevada during the drive." To their credit, none of the staff showed more than momentary surprise at this announcement. Mrs. Chen recovered first, offering a small bow to Josephine. "Welcome, Mrs. Lancaster. The house is prepared for your arrival." "Thank you," Josephine replied, hoping her nervousness wasn't obvious. "I look forward to getting acquainted with all of you." As Miguel and Rosa stepped forward with their own greetings, Josephine noticed Mrs. Chen and Xavier exchanging a look that suggested an entire conversation was taking place without words. She wondered how much Xavier had communicated to his housekeeper in advance, and how much was now being silently explained. "You must be tired from your journey, Mrs. Chen said, turning her attention back to Josephine. "I've prepared a bath and fresh clothing in the master suite. Dinner will be served at 7. Grateful for the chance to wash away the dust of the trail, Josephine thanked her and followed the housekeeper into the house, leaving Xavier to oversee the final disposition of the herd with Frank and the other drovers. The interior of the house was grander than Josephine had anticipated, though it showed signs of the neglect Xavier had mentioned. The furnishings were of good quality but somewhat dated, and there were places where the wallpaper had begun to peel. Still, it was clean and well-maintained, a testament to Mrs. Chen's diligence. The master suite on the second floor took Josephine's breath away. Larger than the entire cabin she had shared with her brothers, it contained a massive 4-poster bed, a sitting area with 2 comfortable chairs near a fireplace, and doors leading to a private bathroom and dressing room. "Your husband sent a telegram from the last town they passed, Mrs. Chen explained as she showed Josephine around. "He instructed me to prepare for your arrival, though he did not provide many details." The slight emphasis on the last words carried a hint of reproach, though not directed at Josephine. It was a somewhat sudden marriage, Josephine admitted, unsure how much to explain to this woman who was essentially a stranger, yet would now be a daily presence in her life. Mrs. Chen's expression softened slightly. "Mr. Lancaster is a good man, honorable, like his uncle before him." She paused, then added with surprising candor, "Though he has been alone too long. It is good that he has found a wife." Before Josephine could respond, the housekeeper efficiently changed the subject, showing her where fresh clothes had been laid out and how to operate the modern plumbing in the bathroom, a luxury Josephine had never experienced. Left alone to bathe and change, Josephine sank into the copper tub filled with gloriously hot water and tried to process everything that had happened. A month ago, she had been a miner's sister in a dying silver town, taking in laundry to supplement their meager income. Now she was the mistress of a substantial ranch, married to a man who remained in many ways a mystery to her. When she emerged from her bath, she found a pale blue dress laid out on the bed, simple but well made, and remarkably close to her size. She wondered if it had belonged to Xavier's aunt, or if Mrs. Chen had somehow worked magic with needle and thread in the short time since Xavier's telegram. Dressed and feeling refreshed, Josephine made her way downstairs to find Xavier waiting in what appeared to be a study, papers spread across a large oak desk. He had also bathed and changed, his trail clothes replaced by clean trousers and a white shirt that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders. He looked up as she entered, his eyes warming in a way that sent an unexpected flutter through her stomach. "You look lovely," he said, rising from his chair. "I see Mrs. Chen has worked her usual miracles." "The dress fits remarkably well," Josephine agreed, smoothing the fabric self-consciously. "Was it your aunt's?" Xavier shook his head. "No, my aunt was quite tall and substantial. Mrs. Chen keeps a supply of various garments for emergencies. She's quite skilled with alterations." He hesitated, then added, "I've arranged for a dressmaker from Sacramento to visit next week, so you can order whatever you need." The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched Josephine, though she felt a moment of panic at the idea of ordering an entire wardrobe when she had always made do with just 2 or 3 dresses. "That's very kind, but it's necessary," Xavier interrupted gently. "You're the mistress of Lancaster Ranch now. There will be social obligations, visitors. I want you to feel comfortable and confident in your new role." Josephine bit her lip, realizing there was much about her new position she hadn't considered. "I'm afraid I don't have much experience with." Social obligations. Belmont wasn't exactly a hub of society. Xavier smiled reassuringly. "There's time to learn, and truthfully, Sierra Creek isn't much for high society either. The gatherings are simple church socials, the occasional dinner with neighbors, harvest festivals." He paused, studying her expression. "What is it? You look concerned." "It's just—" Josephine struggled to articulate her fears. "Everything is happening so quickly. A new home, new responsibilities, a new marriage." She flushed slightly at the last word. "I'm afraid of disappointing you, of failing at what's expected of me." Xavier crossed the room to stand before her, his expression serious. "Josephine, the only expectation I have is that you be yourself. Everything else, the ranch, the social obligations, our relationship, all of it will develop in its own time." He hesitated, then continued more softly, "I know this isn't the life you imagined for yourself, but I hope in time you might find happiness here." Before she could respond, Mrs. Chen appeared at the door to announce dinner was served. The meal was excellent, far better than the trail food Josephine had become accustomed to, though she found herself too nervous to eat much. Xavier kept the conversation light, telling her about the property and his plans for expanding the cattle operation in the coming year. After dinner, they retired to the sitting room where Xavier poured them each a small glass of sherry. As Josephine sipped the unfamiliar drink, she found herself wondering about the sleeping arrangements. They were legally married, had been for over 2 weeks, but Xavier had maintained a careful distance throughout their journey. Now that they were in his home, their home, would his expectations change? As if sensing her thoughts, Xavier cleared his throat. "I've had the blue bedroom prepared for myself," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "The master suite is yours, of course." Josephine looked up in surprise. "But—" "We're married." "Yes," he agreed, "but our marriage began under unusual circumstances. I meant what I said about building a partnership based on mutual respect." He met her gaze directly. "I won't claim a husband's rights until you're ready, Josephine. Until you want me as a true husband, not just the man who bought you away from a worse fate." The blunt honesty of his statement both embarrassed and relieved her. "Thank you," she said softly, "for understanding." He nodded, finishing his sherry in a single swallow. "It's been a long day, and I'm sure you're tired. Perhaps we should retire." As they climbed the stairs together, Josephine felt a strange mixture of emotions: gratitude for Xavier's consideration, uncertainty about their future, and an unexpected pang of something like disappointment that she quickly pushed aside. At the door to the master suite, Xavier paused. "Sleep well, Josephine. Tomorrow, if you're feeling up to it, I'd like to show you more of the ranch." "I'd like that," she replied, suddenly shy under his steady gaze. He leaned forward, and for a breathless moment she thought he might kiss her, but instead he simply squeezed her hand gently. "Good night, then." "Good night." "Xavier," she responded, his given name still feeling new on her tongue. As she closed the door behind her and prepared for bed in the luxurious room that was now hers alone, Josephine wondered at the strange path her life had taken. 3 weeks ago, she had been sold by her brothers to cover a debt. Now she found herself married to a man who seemed determined to give her the very thing her brothers had taken away: the right to choose her own destiny. The weeks following Josephine's arrival at Lancaster Ranch passed in a blur of new experiences and adjustments. True to his word, Xavier arranged for a dressmaker to visit from Sacramento, and despite Josephine's protests about extravagance, insisted that she order a complete wardrobe befitting her new station. The process was overwhelming at first: so many fabrics, styles, and decisions, but gradually, Josephine began to enjoy the novelty of having clothes made specifically for her rather than handed down or cobbled together from whatever was available. Xavier was patient with her as she learned the rhythms of the ranch and her place in it. Each morning, they would have breakfast together before he went out to work with the men, and each evening he would join her for dinner and tell her about his day. He never pressed her about their unusual marital arrangement, maintaining his separate bedroom while treating her with unfailing courtesy and growing warmth. Mrs. Chen proved to be an unexpected ally in Josephine's transition to ranch mistress. Though formal in manner, the housekeeper seemed to have decided that Xavier had chosen well, and took it upon herself to guide Josephine through the practical aspects of running such a large household. Under her tutelage, Josephine learned about managing supplies, planning menus, and the dozen other details that went into maintaining the property. A month after her arrival, Xavier announced at breakfast that they had been invited to dinner at the Henderson Ranch that weekend. "James and Martha are eager to meet you," he explained, watching her reaction carefully. "They've been good neighbors and friends to the Lancaster family for years." Josephine felt a flutter of anxiety. This would be her first social engagement as Mrs. Lancaster, her first opportunity to either confirm or dispel whatever rumors had undoubtedly circulated about Xavier's sudden marriage to a woman from Nevada. "What have you told them about me?" she asked. "About us." Xavier set down his coffee cup, considering his answer. "The truth in its essentials, that we met in Belmont during the cattle drive, that there was a mutual attraction, and that we decided not to wait." His lips quirked in a slight smile. "I left out the details about your brothers and Harrison's debt. Those aren't anyone's business but ours." Josephine nodded, grateful for his discretion. "Do you think they'll like me?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, revealing more of her insecurity than she had intended. Xavier's expression softened. "They'll adore you, Josephine, just as you are." His confidence bolstered her spirits, and by the time Sunday arrived, Josephine felt prepared to face her first social test as Xavier's wife. She wore one of her new dresses, a deep burgundy that the dressmaker had insisted complemented her coloring, and allowed Mrs. Chen to help arrange her hair in a more sophisticated style than her usual simple bun. When she descended the stairs to meet Xavier, the look of appreciation in his eyes sent a flush of pleasure through her. "You look beautiful," he said simply. "Thank you." She smoothed her skirts nervously. "Will I do as the wife of a prominent rancher? You would do as the wife of a king," Xavier replied with unexpected intensity. Seeming to catch himself, he offered his arm more formally. "Shall we?" The Henderson Ranch was smaller than Lancaster's but beautifully maintained, with gardens that showed Martha Henderson's careful attention. The couple that greeted them at the door were in their early 60s, James tall and still military straight despite his age, Martha petite with lively eyes and silver-streaked dark hair. "Xavier." "About time you brought your bride to meet us," Martha exclaimed, embracing him warmly before turning to Josephine. "My dear, we've been beside ourselves with curiosity since we heard the news. Welcome to the valley." Dinner was a pleasant affair, with conversation flowing easily among the four of them. James regaled them with stories from his military days, many of which seemed to involve Xavier's uncle in various misadventures. Martha asked thoughtful questions about Josephine's background, skillfully avoiding anything that might cause embarrassment while genuinely seeking to know her better. "And how are you finding ranch life, my dear?" Martha asked as they had coffee after the meal. "It must be quite a change from Nevada." "It is," Josephine admitted, "but a welcome one. Everyone has been very kind in helping me adjust." "Mrs. Chen can be formidable," Martha said with a knowing smile, "but she's devoted to that house and the Lancaster family. If she's taken you under her wing, you're fortunate indeed." "She has been very patient with my inexperience," Josephine agreed. "Speaking of experiences," James interjected, "Martha tells me you have some background in teaching, Josephine. Is that right?" Josephine glanced at Xavier, surprised he had mentioned this. "I did some informal teaching in Belmont, yes. Nothing official, just helping children whose families couldn't afford the school fees." Martha leaned forward eagerly. "We've been without a teacher in Sierra Creek since Miss Abernathy left in the spring." The children are falling behind, and the town council is growing desperate. Would you perhaps consider taking the position? The directness of the question caught Josephine off guard. I'm not sure I'm qualified. I never had formal training. Can you read, write, and cipher? James asked practically. Yes, of course. Then you're qualified. The position doesn't require fancy credentials out here, just someone with knowledge to share and the patience to deal with children of various ages and abilities. Josephine looked to Xavier, uncertain how he would feel about his wife taking such a position. To her surprise, he was smiling encouragingly. It would be 3 days a week, Martha added. Tuesday through Thursday. The school is small, perhaps 15 children ranging from 6 to 16. You should consider it, Xavier said quietly, if it's something you want. The support in his voice gave her courage. I would need to think about it, she replied carefully, but yes, I might be interested. By the time they rode home that evening, Josephine felt a warm glow of accomplishment. The dinner had gone well, the Hendersons had been welcoming, and for the first time she felt like she might truly find a place for herself in this new community. You were wonderful tonight, Xavier said as they walked up the steps to the house. James and Martha were thoroughly charmed. They're lovely people, Josephine replied. Thank you for arranging the visit. They paused at the top of the stairs where they would normally part ways to their separate bedrooms. In the moonlight streaming through the window, Xavier's face was half in shadow, but Josephine could see the warmth in his eyes as he looked at her. I meant what I said about the teaching position, he said. If it would make you happy, I think you should accept. You wouldn't mind. Having a wife who teaches. Mind. Why would I mind having a wife who uses her intelligence and skills to benefit the community? He shook his head slightly. Josephine, when I spoke of partnership, I meant it. I don't want you to feel confined to the ranch or to the role of simply being my wife. I want you to find fulfillment here in whatever form that takes. Impulsively, Josephine stood on tiptoe and pressed a quick kiss to his cheek. Thank you, she whispered, then stepped back, suddenly shy at her own boldness. Xavier looked momentarily stunned, then a slow smile spread across his face. You're welcome, he replied softly. Good night, Josephine. Good night, Xavier. As she prepared for bed that night, Josephine found herself touching her lips, remembering the feel of his skin against them. It had been a small gesture, innocent really, yet somehow significant. For the first time since their hasty wedding, she allowed herself to truly consider Xavier not just as her rescuer or her business partner in this strange marriage, but as a man, one who was increasingly occupying her thoughts in ways that had nothing to do with gratitude. The next morning at breakfast, Josephine made her decision. I'd like to accept the teaching position, she announced, if you're truly comfortable with it. Xavier looked up from his newspaper with a smile. I think it's an excellent idea. I'll ride into town today and speak with Mayor Collins about the arrangements. True to his word, Xavier returned that evening with confirmation that the position was hers if she wanted it. The school term would begin in 2 weeks, giving her time to prepare lessons and materials. The pay was modest, but that hardly mattered given their circumstances. What mattered to Josephine was the opportunity to do something meaningful, to contribute to their new community in a way that used her natural abilities. In the days that followed, Josephine threw herself into preparations, reviewing the textbooks Xavier procured from Sacramento and planning lessons for children of various ages and abilities. When she wasn't working on her teaching plans, she continued to learn about the ranch operations, often riding out with Xavier to see different parts of the property. It was during one such ride, about a week before school was to begin, that they stopped to rest by a stream flowing through a grove of oak trees. The early autumn weather was perfect, warm but not hot, with a gentle breeze rustling the leaves overhead. This is one of my favorite spots on the property, Xavier said as they sat side by side on a fallen log. My uncle used to bring me here when I visited as a boy. We'd fish for hours. Josephine smiled at the image of a young Xavier learning to fish. You must have been close to him. I was. After my parents died, he became like a second father to me, paid for my education, encouraged me to join the army when that's what I wanted. He picked up a small stone and skipped it across the surface of the stream. I miss him. He would have liked you. Tell me about him, Josephine requested. Realizing how little she knew about Xavier's family history, Xavier's expression grew distant, remembering. Oliver Lancaster, a larger-than-life character in every way. Came west during the gold rush of '49, actually found enough gold to make a start, then had the sense to invest it in land rather than gambling it away like so many others. He was generous to a fault, stubborn as a mule and fiercely loyal to those he cared about. He smiled at some private memory. He met my Aunt Margaret at a dance in Sacramento, claimed he knew she was the one the moment he saw her. They were devoted to each other their entire lives. They never had children, Josephine asked softly. Xavier shook his head. They tried, there were losses. After the third, the doctor advised against trying again. He sighed. I think that's why the condition about marriage was in his will. He wanted the ranch to remain a family home, wanted children to grow up here eventually. He was giving me the push he thought I needed. The wistfulness in his voice touched something in Josephine. Do you want children, Xavier? He looked at her directly, his eyes serious. Yes, someday, when the time is right. After a moment he asked, do you? Josephine nodded slowly. I've always imagined having a family. In Belmont, it seemed like an impossible dream. We could barely feed ourselves, let alone children. But now, she gestured to the beautiful landscape around them. This would be a wonderful place for children to grow up. Something shifted in Xavier's expression, a softening, a warmth that hadn't been there before. Without speaking, he reached out and took her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. The simple touch sent shivers up Josephine's arm. Josephine, he said quietly, I know our beginning was unconventional, but these past weeks, getting to know you, seeing your strength and kindness. I find myself grateful every day for whatever twist of fate brought me to those church steps in Belmont. She felt her heart quicken at his words. I've been thinking about that night, she admitted. About how strange it is that of all the places in that town, we both ended up in the same spot at the same moment. Providence, perhaps, Xavier suggested, his voice low. Perhaps. She looked down at their joined hands, then back up to his face. Or perhaps just extraordinarily good luck on my part. The confession hung in the air between them, changing the atmosphere as surely as a sudden change in weather. Xavier's eyes darkened and he leaned forward slightly, his intention clear. This time when his lips met hers, it was no quick peck on the cheek but a real kiss, gentle at first, then deeper as Josephine responded, her free hand coming up to rest against his chest. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing more rapidly. Xavier rested his forehead against hers, still holding her hand. I've wanted to do that since the moment I saw you on those church steps, he confessed, even with tears streaking my face and my hair a mess. Josephine teased, feeling strangely light-headed, especially then. You looked like a woman who needed rescuing, and I've always had a weakness for damsels in distress. His smile took any sting from the words. Though I've since discovered you're more than capable of rescuing yourself, given half a chance. Josephine laughed softly. Perhaps we rescued each other. They stayed by the stream for another hour, talking more openly than they ever had before, stealing kisses between conversations, beginning to explore the new dimension that had opened in their relationship. When they finally rode back to the ranch, there was a different energy between them, no longer just companions or business partners in an arranged marriage, but a man and woman discovering genuine feelings for each other. That night, as they stood at the top of the stairs, Xavier kissed her once more, then asked quietly, "Would you like me to stay with you tonight?" Josephine felt her cheeks warm, but she nodded. "Yes," she whispered, "I would like that very much." Hand in hand, they entered the master suite together, closing the door on the past and opening it to a future neither had anticipated when they'd met that fateful night in Belmont. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting a golden glow across the bedroom. Josephine stirred, gradually becoming aware of the warm body beside her and the events of the previous night. She opened her eyes to find Xavier already awake, watching her with a tender expression that made her heart skip. "Good morning," he murmured, reaching out to brush a strand of hair from her face. "Good morning," she replied, suddenly shy despite the intimacy they had shared. Being with Xavier had been nothing like she had feared marriage might be. There had been no pain, no sense of duty or obligation, only a deepening connection and genuine pleasure in each other's touch. "Any regrets?" Xavier asked softly, his eyes searching hers. Josephine shook her head. "None. You?" His smile was answer enough, but he spoke anyway. "Only that we waited so long." They might have lingered in bed, exploring this new aspect of their relationship further, but Mrs. Chen's discreet knock at the door reminded them of the day's responsibilities. Xavier reluctantly rose, kissed Josephine once more, then slipped out to retrieve his clothes from the blue bedroom that would now stand empty. Over the following weeks, their relationship blossomed like the late wildflowers that carpeted the valley. Josephine began her teaching position at the Sierra Creek Schoolhouse, finding deep satisfaction in the work despite the challenges of managing students of various ages and abilities. Xavier supported her endeavors wholeheartedly, often riding into town to escort her home and showing genuine interest in her stories about her pupils' progress. In turn, Josephine became more involved in the ranch operations, learning about the business side of cattle ranching and offering suggestions that Xavier received with respect and consideration. Their partnership, once a theoretical arrangement, became a practical reality as they built a life together that incorporated both their strengths and passions. As autumn deepened toward winter, Josephine found herself facing an unexpected challenge. For 3 mornings in a row, she woke feeling nauseated, barely making it to the bathroom before being sick. On the 3rd day, Mrs. Chen appeared at her bedside with a cup of ginger tea and a knowing look. "This will help settle your stomach, Mrs. Lancaster," she said, placing the cup on the bedside table. "My mother made it for me when I was carrying my son." Josephine stared at her, the implication slowly dawning. "You think I'm—" "The signs are there," Mrs. Chen replied practically. "No monthly courses since you arrived, sickness in the morning, fatigue in the afternoons." Her usually stern expression softened. "These are blessings, not burdens, Mrs. Lancaster." When Xavier returned from his morning rounds, Josephine was waiting for him in the study, her heart pounding with a mixture of anxiety and excitement. How would he react to this news? They had spoken of children as a someday possibility, not an immediate reality. Josephine. Xavier's brow furrowed with concern as he entered the room and saw her expression. "Is something wrong? Are you feeling unwell again?" She took a deep breath. "I'm not unwell exactly, at least not in the way you might think." She twisted her hands together nervously. "Xavier, I think. That is, Mrs. Chen believes I might be expecting a child." Xavier went very still, his eyes widening as he processed her words. For a terrible moment, Josephine feared he might be disappointed or upset. Then a smile broke across his face, brighter than any she had seen before. "A child," he repeated, crossing the room to take her hands in his. "Truly," Josephine nodded, relief washing through her at his reaction. "It's early days yet, and I can't be certain, but the signs suggest it." Without warning, Xavier lifted her off her feet in a joyful embrace, spinning her around once before setting her carefully back down. "Josephine, this is wonderful news." He placed a gentle hand on her still flat stomach, his expression filled with wonder. "A child, our child. You're happy then?" She asked, though his reaction had made the answer obvious. Happy doesn't begin to describe it. He cupped her face in his hands. "I love you, Josephine Lancaster. I think I've loved you since that night in Belmont, though I was too cautious to admit it even to myself. And now you're giving me a family, something I've wanted all my life but never truly believed I would have." Tears welled in Josephine's eyes at his declaration. "I love you too," she whispered, realizing as she said it that the words had been true for some time. What had begun as gratitude had grown into respect, then affection, and finally this a love deeper and truer than she had ever imagined possible. The news of Josephine's pregnancy spread quickly through their small community. Martha Henderson was particularly delighted, immediately beginning to knit baby clothes and offering advice from her experiences with her own daughters. The children at the schoolhouse were fascinated by the idea of their teacher having a baby, though Josephine assured them she would continue teaching until close to her time and would return afterward. As winter settled over the valley, the Lancaster ranch took on a festive air in preparation for both Christmas and the coming child. Xavier insisted on redecorating the bedroom adjacent to the master's suite as a nursery, commissioning a local carpenter to build a cradle and other furniture. Josephine, meanwhile, began sewing baby clothes with guidance from Rosa, who had raised 3 children of her own and was a font of practical knowledge about infant care. The Hendersons joined them for Christmas dinner, bringing gifts not only for the holiday but also for the baby expected in late spring. As they sat around the fire after the meal, James raised his glass in a toast. "To new life and new beginnings," he said, smiling at Xavier and Josephine. "May your family know the same joy and prosperity that this land has brought to the Lancasters for the past generation. And may that prosperity continue for generations to come," Martha added, her eyes twinkling as she patted Josephine's hand. Later that night, as they lay together in their bed, Xavier pulled Josephine close, his hand resting protectively over the slight swell of her stomach where their child grew. "I was thinking about what James said tonight," he murmured. "About new beginnings. MMM." Josephine was drowsy, content in the warmth of his embrace. "When I rode into Belmont that day, I had no idea my life was about to change completely. I was just focused on getting the herd to market, making the ranch profitable for another year." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "If I hadn't stopped at that church, if you hadn't been sitting on those steps." "But you did, and I was," Josephine replied softly. "And here we are, he agreed. "Sometimes I still can't believe it that your brother's cruelty could ultimately lead to such happiness." Josephine had thought of her brothers often in the past months, wondering how they were faring with the money Xavier had given them. She had written twice, receiving one brief response from Tobias indicating that they had used part of the money to buy into a more promising claim and were doing better than before. The letter had been awkward, the words of someone unsure how to address a sister he had once been willing to sell, but it had been something. "I've been thinking," she said, turning in Xavier's arms to face him. "Perhaps in the spring, after the baby comes, we might invite them to visit." "Samuel and Tobias, I mean." Xavier's expression was carefully neutral. "If that's what you want, but only if you're truly ready to see them again. They hurt you deeply, Josephine." She nodded, acknowledging the truth of his words. "They did. But they're still the only family I have besides you and this little one." She placed her hand over his on her stomach. "I don't want to carry anger or resentment into our child's life, and perhaps seeing the life we've built, might help them understand the gravity of what they almost did." Xavier's expression softened with admiration. "Your capacity for forgiveness continues to amaze me, Mrs. Lancaster." "Not forgiveness, exactly," Josephine clarified. "Understanding, perhaps, and a desire to make peace with the past so we can fully embrace our future." "Then we'll invite them," Xavier agreed, "though I make no promises about how warmly I'll receive them." Josephine smiled, knowing that beneath his protective exterior, Xavier understood the importance of family connections, he who had lost so much of his own family at a young age. "That's all I ask." As winter gave way to spring, Josephine's body changed with the seasons, her belly growing round with new life. She continued teaching until early May, when the increasing discomfort of her condition and the distance to town made it impractical to continue. The school board had already arranged for a temporary replacement, the minister's wife, who had taught before her marriage and assured Josephine her position would be waiting when she was ready to return. On a warm June morning, just as the sun was cresting the eastern hills, Josephine's labor began. Mrs. Chen took charge immediately, sending Miguel to fetch the midwife from Sierra Creek, while Rosa prepared the birthing room they had readied weeks before. Xavier, pale but determined, refused to leave Josephine's side despite Mrs. Chen's protests that it wasn't proper. "I don't care about proper," he insisted, holding Josephine's hand as another contraction gripped her. "I'm staying with my wife." The labor was long and difficult, nearly 18 hours of pain and effort that tested Josephine's endurance to its limits. Throughout it all, Xavier remained steady, wiping her brow, speaking words of encouragement, his presence an anchor in the storm of pain. Just after midnight, with a final, exhausting push, Josephine brought their son into the world, a robust baby with a shock of dark hair and a powerful set of lungs that he used immediately upon arrival. A boy. The midwife announced, quickly cleaning and wrapping the infant before placing him in Josephine's trembling arms. A fine, healthy son. Josephine stared down at the tiny face, overwhelmed by a love so fierce and protective it brought tears to her eyes. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "We've been waiting for you." Xavier sat beside her on the bed, one arm around her shoulders, the other gently touching their son's cheek with a fingertip. "He's perfect," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "just like his mother." They named him Oliver James Lancaster, honoring both Xavier's uncle and their good friend and neighbor. Little Oliver thrived from the start, nursing vigorously and growing steadily under the adoring eyes of his parents and the entire ranch household. Mrs. Chen, normally so reserved, could be seen smiling as she rocked him while Josephine rested. Miguel carved him wooden toys, and Rosa sang Spanish lullabies that seemed to soothe him instantly when he was fussy. In late August, when Oliver was 2 months old, a letter arrived from Belmont. It was from Tobias, responding to Josephine's invitation to visit. "Samuel and I will arrive by stage in Sierra Creek on September 15th, he wrote. "We are both eager to meet our nephew and see your new home. Samuel asks me to convey his particular thanks for the invitation, which he knows could not have been easy to extend." Josephine read the letter aloud to Xavier as they sat on the porch in the evening, Oliver sleeping peacefully in his father's arms. "Are you sure about this?" Xavier asked, his protective instincts clearly warring with his desire to support Josephine's wishes. "Having them here in our home, I'm sure," Josephine replied firmly. "It's time to build bridges, not walls. Oliver should know his uncles, flawed as they may be." Xavier looked down at their sleeping son, then back to Josephine. "You continue to teach me about grace, Mrs. Lancaster." He leaned over to kiss her softly. "Very well. We'll welcome them as family, but they'll be staying in the guest rooms, not the main house." Josephine smiled at his compromise. "Agreed." When September 15th arrived, Xavier insisted on accompanying Josephine and Oliver to meet the stage in Sierra Creek. They waited on the boardwalk outside the general store, Josephine holding Oliver, who was awake and alert, his dark eyes taking in the unfamiliar surroundings with interest. The stage arrived precisely at noon, dust billowing around it as it came to a stop. Several passengers disembarked, but Josephine immediately spotted her brothers, among them Samuel, still tall and weathered, Tobias slightly stooped but both looking healthier and better dressed than when she had last seen them. For a moment, no one moved. Then Tobias stepped forward, his expression a mixture of nervousness and hope. "Josie," he said simply, "you look well." "Hello, Tobias, Samuel." Josephine's voice was steady, though her heart raced. "Welcome to Sierra Creek." She shifted Oliver in her arms so they could see him better. "This is your nephew, Oliver James Lancaster." Samuel, who had remained slightly behind his brother, finally stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the baby. "He has Pa's chin," he observed quietly. "And Mama's eyes, I think," Tobias added, smiling hesitantly at the infant. Xavier, who had been standing protectively at Josephine's side, finally spoke. "We have a buggy waiting. It's about 10 miles to the ranch." The brothers nodded, gathering their bags. As they walked to the buggy, Tobias fell into step beside Josephine. "The claim is producing well," he said, clearly trying to bridge the awkward gap between them. "We've hired 2 men to help with the extraction. Samuel's even talking about expanding." "I'm glad to hear it," Josephine replied sincerely. "And your teaching position?" Tobias asked. "Your letters mentioned you were teaching at the local school. I'm taking some time now while Oliver is small, but I'll return in the spring." She smiled down at her son, who had dozed off despite the activity around him. "The school board has been very accommodating." As they rode to the ranch, The initial tension gradually eased as Josephine asked questions about Belmont and familiar faces there. By the time they arrived at Lancaster Ranch, the conversation was flowing more naturally, though Xavier remained watchful, his gaze frequently assessing the brothers' interactions with Josephine. The guest house proved to be a comfortable two-room cabin near the main house, originally built for the ranch foreman but currently unoccupied since Frank Murphy preferred to live above the stables. After giving her brothers time to settle in, Josephine led them on a tour of the property, pride evident in her voice as she explained the operations and her role in them. "You've done well for yourself, Josie," Samuel said as they walked back toward the main house for dinner. It was the closest he had come to acknowledging the circumstances of her departure from Belmont. "I have," she agreed, though not in the way any of us might have expected. That evening, after a somewhat tense but overall pleasant dinner, Xavier excused himself to put Oliver to bed, giving Josephine time alone with her brothers. As they sat in the parlor with after-dinner coffee, Samuel finally addressed the elephant in the room. "I owe you an apology, Josie," he said, setting down his cup with a decisive click. "What Tobias and I did, it was wrong, desperate, but wrong." Josephine studied her oldest brother's face, seeing genuine remorse there. "Yes, it was," she agreed quietly. "You were willing to sacrifice my happiness, my entire future, to solve a problem of your own making." Samuel winced but didn't argue. "I know, there's no excuse good enough for what we did. But I want you to know that not a day goes by that I don't thank whatever Providence sent Lancaster to Belmont that night." He glanced around at the comfortable room, then back to her. "You deserved better than what we offered you, and by some miracle you found it." "Not Providence," Josephine corrected gently. "Xavier. He chose to help a stranger in distress. He offered me a choice when you gave me none, and he has proven himself to be a man of his word in every way since." Tobias, who had been quiet during this exchange, finally spoke. "We're truly happy for you, Josie, for this life you've built for little Oliver." He hesitated, then added softly, "And we hope that someday you might find it in your heart to truly forgive us." Josephine considered her brothers thoughtfully. The anger she had carried had faded over the months, replaced by a sadness for what might have been and gratitude for what was. "I'm working on it," she said honestly. "Being happy helps, having Xavier and Oliver helps, seeing that you've both changed, that helps too." It wasn't complete forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning, a bridge being rebuilt one careful plank at a time. When Xavier returned downstairs, he found the siblings in easier conversation, sharing memories of their parents that had Josephine both laughing and wiping away occasional tears. He joined them, adding his own stories of his uncle and the early days of the ranch, gradually weaving their separate histories into a shared narrative that might, with time and care, form the foundation of a new family connection. The brothers stayed for a week, gradually becoming more comfortable with Xavier and utterly enchanted by little Oliver. Samuel proved to have a natural gift with the baby, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he held his nephew. Tobias, always the more sensitive of the two, brought out a carved wooden horse he had made himself, the first of many toys he promised to send as Oliver grew. On their last evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the valley in shades of gold and crimson, Samuel turned to Xavier with an expression of grudging respect. "You're a better man than I am, Lancaster," he said bluntly. "I'm not sure I could have welcomed my wife's brothers into my home if they had treated her the way we treated Josie." Xavier's arm tightened slightly around Josephine's shoulders. "It wasn't my decision to make," he replied evenly. "Josephine wanted to rebuild these bridges, and I trust her judgment." After a moment, he added, "Family is precious. I learned that the hard way, losing mine so young. Sometimes it's worth fighting through the hard feelings to preserve what remains." Samuel nodded slowly, accepting the gentle rebuke in Xavier's words. "Well, you've got family now, a son, a wife, and 2 brothers-in-law who owe you a debt we can never repay. Just be the uncles Oliver deserves," Xavier replied. "That will be payment enough." The next morning, as they prepared to depart for the return journey to Belmont, Josephine embraced each of her brothers, feeling a sense of closure that had been missing since that fateful day when they had told her of their arrangement with Wilson Garrick. "Write more often," she instructed them. "And perhaps visit again next summer. Oliver will be walking by then, I expect. Wild horses couldn't keep us away," Tobias promised, kissing her cheek. As the buggy carrying her brothers disappeared down the long drive, Xavier wrapped his arm around Josephine's waist, Oliver secure in his other arm. "No regrets?" he asked quietly. Josephine leaned into his embrace, looking up at the man who had changed her life with a single act of compassion and the home they had built together. "None," she replied with complete certainty. "How could I regret the path that led me here, to you, to Oliver, to this life we share?" Xavier smiled, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Come on, Mrs. Lancaster. Our son is getting hungry and we have a ranch to run." Hand in hand, they walked back to the house, their future stretching before them as wide and promising as the valley below. 5 years passed, bringing changes both expected and surprising to Lancaster Ranch. Oliver grew from a chubby infant into a lively, curious child with his father's dark hair and his mother's thoughtful brown eyes. He was joined 2 years after his birth by a sister, Margaret Rose, named for Xavier's aunt and Josephine's mother. Maggie, as they called her, was fair where her brother was dark, with blonde curls and a determined spirit that kept her parents constantly on their toes. Josephine had returned to teaching as planned, though now she taught only 2 days a week, preferring to spend more time with her children and the ranch operations that increasingly interested her. Under her guidance, the Lancaster Ranch had expanded to include a small dairy operation that produced cheese and butter sold in Sacramento and as far away as San Francisco. The additional income stream had been Xavier's idea, but it was Josephine's practical management that made it successful. Samuel and Tobias visited every summer, bearing gifts for the children and stories of Belmont, which was experiencing a modest revival thanks to a new silver strike in the hills north of town. They had rebuilt their family bond slowly but steadily, the past not forgotten but no longer a barrier between them. On a warm spring morning, as Josephine sat on the porch watching Oliver teach his little sister how to play with a wooden top, Xavier joined her, coffee cups in hand. "They're growing so fast," he observed, passing her a cup. "Seems like yesterday Oliver was the size Maggie is now." Josephine agreed, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Mother said time accelerates once you have children. I never understood what she meant until now." Xavier settled into the chair beside her, his gaze fond as he watched their children play. At 35, he was still as handsome as the day she had met him, though the years of ranch work had added a few lines around his eyes and threads of silver at his temples that Josephine found distinguished rather than aging. "I had a letter from James Henderson this morning," he said after a moment. "He and Martha are finally taking that trip east they've been planning for years. They'll be gone for 6 months, visiting their daughters and grandchildren." "That's wonderful," Josephine replied. "They deserve the time with their family." She glanced at Xavier curiously. "But you have that look you get when you're planning something. What are you thinking?" He smiled, caught out. "I was thinking that perhaps it's time we did some traveling of our own. Not for 6 months, of course, but maybe a few weeks. San Francisco, perhaps? Oliver is old enough now to appreciate the sights, and Mrs. Chen and Rosa would help with Maggie if we wanted some time to ourselves." Josephine considered the idea. They had rarely left the ranch in the 5 years of their marriage, except for occasional business trips Xavier made to Sacramento. The thought of seeing San Francisco, its hills and bay, the bustling streets and fine restaurants Xavier had described to her, was enticing. "I'd like that," she said, smiling at her husband. "A family adventure." "Good." Xavier reached over to take her hand, his thumb brushing over the gold band he had placed on her finger that day in Belmont. "Because I've already written to reserve rooms at the Occidental Hotel for 2 weeks in July." Josephine laughed at his presumption. "Rather confident I would agree, weren't you? I've learned that my wife rarely refuses an opportunity for new experiences, he replied, his eyes twinkling. It's one of the many things I love about her. Their conversation was interrupted by Oliver running up to them, his face alight with excitement. Papa, Mama, riders coming, I saw dust on the road, Xavier stood, shading his eyes to peer down the long drive. So there are, looks like Frank and the men returning from the north pasture. He ruffled Oliver's hair affectionately. Good spotting, son, you have sharp eyes. Like Papa, Oliver declared proudly, climbing onto Xavier's chair to get a better view. Can I ride with you to meet them? Not today, partner, they're almost here anyway. Xavier glanced at Josephine with a smile. Though perhaps tomorrow we could take that ride to the creek you've been asking about, if your mother agrees. Please, Mama, Oliver turned pleading eyes to Josephine. I'll be careful, I promise. Of course you can go, Josephine assured him. As long as you mind your father and don't go near the deep water. As Oliver ran to share the news with his sister, Xavier returned to his seat beside Josephine. He's becoming quite the horseman, he observed proudly. Takes to it naturally. He takes after his father in many ways, Josephine replied, though thank goodness he seems to have my even temper rather than your stubborn streak. Xavier laughed. My stubborn streak. I seem to recall a certain schoolteacher who refused to let the board reduce her salary just because she was a married woman with means. That wasn't stubbornness, that was principle, Josephine countered, though she was smiling too. The memory of her confrontation with the school board 2 years earlier had become something of a legend in Sierra Creek, how Mrs. Lancaster had calmly but firmly explained that her work was worth the same whether she was married to the richest rancher in the valley or the poorest farmer. As Frank and the ranch hands approached the house, waving to the family on the porch, Josephine was struck by a sudden wave of gratitude for the life she now led. From the desperate young woman sitting on church steps in Belmont to the confident wife, mother, teacher, and businesswoman, she had become the transformation sometimes seemed miraculous. What are you thinking? Xavier asked softly, noting her contemplative expression. I was thinking about how differently things might have turned out, she admitted. If you hadn't come to Belmont that day, if you hadn't stopped to speak to a crying stranger, Xavier's expression grew serious. I've thought about that too over the years. The series of small decisions that led to that moment. He took her hand, raising it to his lips in a gesture that still made her heart flutter after 5 years of marriage. I rode into that town looking to buy supplies, not a bride. But I found something far more valuable than I could have imagined. We both did, Josephine agreed softly. A partnership, a family, a love that grew from the most unlikely beginning. Xavier smiled, leaning in to kiss her properly. And that, Mrs. Lancaster, is worth every penny of the $4,000 I paid for you. Josephine laughed, swatting his arm playfully. Be careful, Mr. Lancaster. I'm worth considerably more now with my teaching salary and the profits from the dairy. Priceless, Xavier corrected, his expression growing tender. Beyond any measure of value, he stood, offering his hand to help her up as Frank and the men reached the yard. Shall we go greet our people, wife? Lead the way, husband, Josephine replied, slipping her hand into his. Together, they stepped off the porch to welcome the returning ranch hands, their children running ahead of them in the golden California sunshine, the future stretching before them as bright and promising as the land they had made their own.